Hello, everybody. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives. And this morning, I'm happy to read my final. I really got so much out of this book that I know I'll be picking it up from time to time for reference. And it is interesting that how over the years, the investigative journalist George Webb and I have worked together, and a long time ago, it seemed to me that George was like working on the immediate right now stuff, and I was working on the stuff that happened, during my dad's lifetime, but we were working toward the same ends. And I think that that actually has come together here when we're talking about Dr. Walter Schreiber, who comes from being the chief general surgeon of the Nazis during World War II. And of course, he also becomes a paperclip. So, as George was saying this past week, he leads into the American biowarfare program when he gets a berth down in Texas, and that's where we're going to pick up the book today. So, still in the chapter called "Rewriting the Past," and once again, I think it's really cool that there is reference on page 243 to a William Underhill at the FBI who fought against the Nazis, who tried to keep them out, and that therefore it's very likely that a backlog of applications would have started to grow, and that perhaps does fulfill what I was thinking about, the 68,000 application files that my father supervised under J. Edgar Hoover in the early 50s. Well, anyway, I think that's really a cool thing for me to dig further on. We're on page 255, and we just talked about how this Dr. H.W. Batchelor from Camp Detrick, which is, was Camp Detrick, now it's Fort Detrick in Maryland, were American biological warfare experts who interviewed Kurt Blome, and they ended up giving him a contract. Doesn't that sound kind of like Hollywood, or a baseball team, give this guy a contract? Well, that's where we left off last time. Next paragraph is Marianus Czerny, another Project 63 scientist, was an expert spectroscopist. He had already been employed as a paperclip scientist in California, but he had returned to Germany because of sensitivity over his high-level Nazi contacts and his Gestapo activities. In the midst of the Korean War, the Pentagon assumed it possessed unquestioned power to mastermind and manipulate the location, employment, and destiny of scientists such as Blome and Czerny, as if they were strategic pawns in a military operation. As if. One of the first to arrive at Randolph Air Force Base was Dr. Walter Schreiber, described as a hygiene expert. During the war, Schreiber was the head of the Department for Science and Health in the German High Command, with special responsibility for combating infectious diseases and epidemics. Under his authority, quote, doctors, unquote, in concentration camps conducted experiments on inmates that usually resulted in a slow and agonizing death. Some of those convicted and sentenced to death in post-war trials in Germany for their part in these experiments claimed that Schreiber had witnessed their activities. Schreiber successfully denied the allegations, and American lawyers were unable to prove that the results of the experiments had been passed to Schreiber. who rapidly translated them into a sanitized and authoritative reports that so impressed first the Russians and then the Americans, In October 1948, Schreiber arrived in the American zone after appearing as a prosecution witness for the Russians at the International Nuremberg War Crimes Trial against his former colleagues and mysteriously claimed he had escaped from his captors. Schreiber had been captured by the Russians first in Berlin when the Russians took Berlin. Subsequently, in 1950, he was appointed camp physician at the U.S. military subpost at Ober-Ursel and then was evacuated to Texas as a denial case with his family in September 1951. Soon after his arrival in Texas, protests began, especially from Jewish groups. And I would clarify that I believe that the military subpost was Camp King. As the protests escalated, Robert Lovett, the Secretary of Defense, ordered an immediate investigation into Project 63, revealing that the Army had never received high-level authorization for the operation. Alarmed by the glare of publicity, the Army immediately canceled Bloma's and Czerny's contracts. But to avoid endangering other Project 63 contracts or annoying Bloma, the former SA officer was given Schreiber's post as camp doctor at the Army's European Command Intelligence Center in Ober-Ursel. In Washington, after intensive discussion, Lovett publicly pledged that Schreiber would be returned to Germany for investigation. To the military, Lovett's assurance was astonishing. If Schreiber were returned to Germany, the fate of many other incriminated scientists in America would be perilously uncertain, and Schreiber himself would undoubtedly be tempted to expose Project 63, as well as the presence of the aviation doctors at Randolph. At first, Colonel Benjamin Heckmeyer, JIOA's new director, trotted out the customary neutral response, which ignored everything except the most recent past. Quote, although it has been alleged that Dr. Schreiber was implicated in human experiments during the war, these allegations are not supported by available records. Dr. Schreiber's conduct has been exemplary in all respects, and the School of Aviation Medicine reports that he has consistently shown a highly cooperative attitude, intense industry, and application to his assigned duties, unquote. Cryptically, Heckmeyer suggested that Schreiber had, quote, indicated a desire to go to Argentina, where his daughter now resides, and carry on his research in his chosen field, unquote. Schreiber's sudden preference for Argentina was the ideal solution. South America was by then a well-established haven for Nazi war criminals, many of them traveling from Europe at Washington's expense. Lovett's pledge to return Schreiber to Germany was conveniently forgotten. Air Force headquarters in Washington immediately asked the air attaché in Buenos Aires to arrange Schreiber's immigration, quote, as his return to Germany is not desirable from our viewpoint, unquote. To sweeten Schreiber's agreement to leave America quietly, his contract was amended to allow the Air Force to pay for his passage, which had already been booked for May 22nd, and he was given a generous travel allowance. Amid fears of a congressional inquiry, a complete publicity blackout was ordered, and officers in Bonn and Argentina were asked to lobby government contracts to provide the passports, lobby government contacts to provide the passports and visas needed to ensure the speedy evaporation of an embarrassment. Quote, Schreiber's immediate departure, U.S. extremely urgent, unquote. Washington cabled to General Lewis in Wiesbaden on May 6, 1952, Quote, for your info, if entry into Argentina cannot be effected in immediate future, strong possibility exists. Subject may be returned to Germany, regardless of objections above agencies and CIA being advised this possibility. 3 months after Schreiber's safe arrival at his daughter's home in Argentina, the American Jewish Congress passed a resolution condemning the employment of former Nazis and calling for their return to Germany, the war criminals among them to stand trial. Lovett asked for a historical brief on Paperclip. The military, somewhat tainted by the debacle in Korea, chose its words carefully. The first draft began with the assertion that their program did not, quote, violate the existing laws or policies of the U.S. from a legal or moral standpoint, unquote, and stressed that no one known to have been guilty of war crimes was admitted to the United States. And here's a quote. Dr. Walter Schreiber, mentioned in the resolution, was completely investigated by the CIC and the CIA prior to his arrival in the U.S. without any indication of conviction for or participation in the inhuman Nazi medical experiments, nor of membership of the Nazi Party. These allegations were first made without foundation by a Dr. Alexander of Boston, Massachusetts, who is closely allied with the American Jewish Congress, unquote. The completed memorandum submitted to Lovett and signed by Major General Clark Ruffner was a disingenuous cocktail of evasions and ambiguities. As ever, the use of criminals was flatly denied, while the protesters were condemned as victims of communist infiltration. Schreiber, Lovett was informed, was only, quote, alleged to be employed by the German Air Force, and, quote, was neither accused nor tried for war crimes, unquote. Since he was now in South America, Ruffner proposed that the issue be forgotten and presented a draft reply to the AJC that unashamedly repeated Royal's riposte to a similar protest in 1947, quote, no known war criminal, ardent Nazi, or profiteer or notorious supporter of Nazism or militarism is eligible under the project, unquote. Pardon me. All right, chapter 12, the final irony. On the day chosen for the mass swearing in, excuse me. Pardon me. All right, chapter 12, the final irony. On the day chosen for the mass swearing in of German scientists as citizens of the United States, few realized that the crowning glory of the Paperclip Conspiracy had coincided with the anniversary of the Kaiser's ignominious surrender in 1918. In a bizarre public ceremony, rich in irony, on November 11th, 1954, about 100 Peenemünde scientists were crowded amid jocular confusion onto a floodlit stage in Birmingham, Alabama, as the heavily accented voices discordantly swore allegiance to the American flag. Even fewer realized that Sam Klaus, now fighting on another front, was suffering his second humiliating defeat. The victors this time were not a handful of officers in the Pentagon, but a battery of European industrialists and bankers who had tenaciously clung to the spoils of war earned during the heyday of Nazi Germany. Klaus, the supreme investigator, had originally become preoccupied with Paperclip because it violated the Safe Haven program, an operation he had created in 1943 to eliminate the financial and commercial power of German banks and corporations in the neutral countries of Europe and South America. There was an unusual and confirmed certainty about his targets. In anticipation of war, all of the major German corporations had masked the ownership of their subsidiaries outside Germany, using a variety of ingenious disguises to avoid seizure. To exploit their legal camouflage and to prevent German industry and the German military from repeating their brilliant post 1918 plot to maintain secret research and development centers in friendly countries, at the end of the war, Klaus had corralled compliant South American governments into agreeing to the repatriation of all Germans in the Southern Hemisphere. Originally, Klaus had described the policy to America's allies as a means of preventing, quote, the resurgence of enemy activity at its inception, unquote. But with the enthusiastic support of Treasury and Justice officials, safe haven was soon transformed into a dogged hunt for Germany's vast wartime loot stashed away in the banks and vaults of Europe. Estimates of the hoard's value were upward of $1 billion at 1939 prices, and some responsible officials put Germany's total foreign assets at 3 times that amount. Safe haven, in their eyes, was synonymous with a crusade for justice. Their targets were the neutral countries, Portugal, Spain, Sweden, and especially Switzerland, who, in enviable contrast to the misery, despair, and destruction surrounding them in occupied Europe, had enjoyed security, peace, and considerable profit at their neighbors' expense, while others were suffering the privations of war. Throughout the war, Anglo-American policy toward the neutrals had been frustratingly ambivalent and difficult to reconcile. The British regretfully recognized the limitations of their own power to enforce a blockade and, within those constraints, did their best by means of diplomacy to lure the neutrals away from close relations with the Axis countries. The Foreign Office believed there was no alternative but to accept that the neutrals would continue trading with Germany and to try to extract some advantage from the situation. Officials at the Board of Economic Warfare in Washington were outraged by Britain's tolerant attitude and disdainful of her failure to destroy Germany and the neutrals by economic sanctions. Impatient and unwilling to be soothed by British explanations, the board's representatives in London demanded tough measures against Hitler's silent supporters. Franco's Spain should have been Hitler's natural ally, but preoccupied with ensuring his own survival, the new dictator had refused to openly declare any allegiance. Similarly, Portugal's dictator Antonio Salazar sympathized with Hitler but resisted exposing his impoverished country to the ravages of war. Both countries provided a welcome and welcoming haven for Nazi agents while tolerating an Allied presence. Historically, Sweden and Switzerland had remained politically and militarily neutral during all of Europe's fratricidal conflicts since the age of Napoleon. Emotionally and economically, however, despite the horrors committed in occupied Europe, both sympathized with the Teutonic cause. Isn't that amazing to read that in a book written in 1987? The Teutonic cause. So there's this Aryanness of this brotherhood of Teutons, Teutonic, you know, give me those big helmets with the horns, Teutonic Knights of Switzerland. All right, back to the book. Teutonic. Wow. Undoubtedly, Switzerland, with her wealth, industries, and strategic location, was the most important neutral throughout the war, especially since 100,000 Germans were permanent residents. Moreover, the Swiss railway network was the hub of Central European trade, while Swiss banks had traditionally prospered by affording foreigners a discreet, quote, safe haven, unquote, for their fortunes. Interesting. So that's Operation Safe Haven. Got it. The official British and American policy was to prevent all imports from reaching Switzerland, except food and fodder. But unofficially, Washington and London recognized in exasperation that Switzerland's intimate peacetime links with Germany had hugely expanded since the outbreak of war. Blinded by their pro-German bias, many Swiss were convinced right up to 1945 that Germany would be victorious. Despite Allied protests, throughout the war, Bern placed the Swiss railways and Alpine tunnels at Germany's disposal to serve as a strategic link with the Wehrmacht armies in Italy. Every major German industry had either tentacles penetrating deep inside Swiss society or business associates across the border. Swiss executives naturally maintained close ties with their German parent companies, and Switzerland's export to Germany of ammunition, aircraft parts, radio equipment, fuses, diesel engines, and chemicals ceaselessly grew. Quote, these activities, unquote, Henry Stimson, the American Secretary of War, was told, quote, were of substantial assistance to the Germans in waging war. Simultaneously, Swiss bankers, courteously and occasionally even enviously, provided an efficient and flexible service for their powerful German clients. Often reaping huge profits in the process, intercepts by Allied intelligence of messages between Switzerland and Germany proved to Washington's satisfaction that, quote, Switzerland's aid to the enemy in the banking field was clearly beyond the obligations under which a neutral must continue trade with a belligerent, unquote. In return, Germany supplied coal and steel, imports that were vital to Switzerland's survival, and thus provided the Swiss with an excuse for supping with the devil. The Allies in their darkest hours were impotent and had no alternative but to turn a blind eye for the Allies to justify their inability to enforce their blockade. They had to deem Switzerland's infractions of her neutrality acceptable, since the country was a good intelligence center, a useful refuge for escaped Allied POWs, and a source of valuable materials. Allied propaganda, however, claimed that the blockade had successfully isolated Germany and was fatally squeezing the nation's industrial life. In fact, the opposite was true. German scientists and technicians had astonishingly produced, in place of the blockaded metals, rubber, textile, and petroleum products, a range of synthetic substitutes that were superior to the natural equivalents. Excuse me. American experts, wrote David Gordon of the Blockade Division, quote, woefully underestimated the extent and significance of these preparations, unquote. These and similar revelations of German ingenuity transformed the anger of many Allied officers into awe. But such feelings did not inhibit those officials whose objective was to strip Germany of its plunder. Their hopes of success improved following the Wehrmacht's collapse at Stalingrad and the Allied victory in North Africa. On January 5th, 1943, the State Department issued a warning that it would not recognize the legality of any sale of German looted gold. This warning was provoked by the discovery that during the previous 12 months, Germany's gold payments to Switzerland far exceeded her pre-war reserves. The extra gold came from the reserves of the banks in the countries occupied by German armies. By the end of the war, 1.6 billion Swiss francs of gold had passed from Germany to Switzerland, 10 times Germany's total pre-war reserves. That's a pretty darn good heist, isn't it? Good gracious. Oh. In protest at her close relations with the Nazis, the Allies sharply restricted Switzerland's food supplies for 3 months in 1943. and demanded a 40% reduction in Swiss exports. After the Swiss had given assurances that they would comply, Allied intelligence chiefs prided themselves that their pressure had been successful, but in fact, Swiss supplies to Germany actually doubled during that period. As payment, Germany used the stolen gold, thus creating a precious lifeline for foreign trade. Nearly all the looted gold passed through Switzerland, but by September 1944, Swiss banks were embarrassed by the amount in their vaults and began negotiating secret sales. Post-war investigations revealed that while $161 million of Dutch gold was sold to Switzerland, a mere $30 million had been passed on to Sweden and Portugal. Not one of those three neutrals could have been in doubt as to the gold's true ownership, since the bars were carelessly delivered in their original Dutch wrapping paper. The officials of the Reichsbank took more precautions when they wished to dispose of $123 million of stolen Belgian gold. Before delivery, the bars were resmelted, impressed with pre-war German markings, and only afterwards sold to the Swiss National Bank. Admiring the finesse of the procedure, the Swiss National Bank followed suit, resmelting the looted gold in its vaults and converting it into Swiss coins. But this nonchalance was abruptly curtailed by the Normandy invasion. In some frenzy, as clandestine meetings throughout Germany, bankers, industrialists, and even senior Nazi officials established sophisticated schemes for the transfer of money and technical know-how to secret safe havens for use after the inevitable defeat. The foreign destinations were obvious, but the methods and the camouflage used were brilliant and had been artfully devised to be legally impenetrable. In their haste, however, elaborate and costly deceptions were occasionally abandoned. On June 26, 1944, Allied agents noted a German plane landing at Lisbon. Two couriers carrying 4 bags labeled diplomatic baggage were met by a car from the German embassy. Each bag contained 20 kilos of gold. The event inaugurated a pattern that would be repeated throughout Europe over the following weeks. Quote, "This tendency of the Germans," unquote, noted a member of the Foreign Office, quote, "to transfer nest eggs to their legations in neutral countries needs watching, but I do not see what more we could do to prevent it," unquote. The source of Germany's loot was not only the national banks of its defeated adversaries. During the 12 years of the Third Reich, German bankers, industrialists, and entrepreneurs ransacked the continent of Europe and amassed vast amounts of valuables, precious stones, objects d'art, shares, minerals, machinery, and patents. Among their victims were governments, corporations, and private citizens. The gigantic institutions of the Reich robbed and pillaged on a vast scale. The proceeds of plunder swelled the assets of the mighty Deutsche Bank fivefold to $5.5 billion. The scale of theft by individuals was also gigantic. Craftily, however, most of their loot was not deposited with the prestigious Zurich headquarters of the Swiss banks. Instead, it was entrusted to compliant branch managers in unknown alpine villages and small towns far beyond the suspicions and penetration of any Allied investigator. Kurt Becher, a colonel in the SS, was typical of many furtive German visitors to Switzerland in the last year of the war. Born in 1909 in Hamburg, Becher ended his wartime career as Adolf Eichmann's superior officer in Budapest. While Eichmann supervised the rounding up of Hungary's 200,000 Jews and their transportation to immediate death at Auschwitz. According to at least one published report and various government documents in Berlin, Becher took charge of the doomed Jews' valuables, worth many millions of dollars. The, quote, legitimate destination of the loot was Himmler's headquarters, and thence to the Reichsbank in Berlin. En route, Becher siphoned off several sacks of precious stones and headed to St. Margarethen in Switzerland, where he deposited a considerable fortune for safekeeping. After the war, Becher was released unprosecuted from the American internment camp, and he used his nest egg to establish one of Europe's largest grain dealerships, based in Hamburg and still flourishing today. Over the years, it has earned many millions of dollars in profits. It was to prevent the lasting enrichment of former Nazis like Becker that Klaus sought the support of America's allies for the safe haven program. Only a united front, he realized, would compel the neutrals to hand over the German deposits. The British were, on all counts, very reluctant partners. Washington's declaration about looted gold in 1943 was, in Whitehall's opinion, too difficult to implement. And Claus's scheme to seize German assets in all the neutral countries was sniffily criticized as a legal minefield. Disconcertingly, there can be little doubt that British hesitancy to strip the Germans of their ill-gotten wealth was associated with a strain of anti-Semitism within the Foreign Office that had been only too evident ever since the first reports of the Nazi persecution policies in the early 1930s. After a deputation from the Board of Deputies of British Jews left the Foreign Office in April 1944, having sought support for the recovery of stolen Jewish property, one official wrote, quote, "We shall be under very strong pressure, particularly in the U.S., to allow the Jews not only to stamp on the Germans' faces after we have knocked them down, but to strip them naked as well," unquote. At the same time, Con O'Neill, an enigmatic junior official in the Central Department, voiced Britain's unwillingness to offend the defeated Germans by, quote, "seeking to reestablish the position of the Jews in Germany, which no German is likely to want," unquote. Wow. In a draft directive addressed to Eisenhower to guide his post-war policy in Germany, Foreign Office officials decided that the Germans should not be compelled to compensate the Jews. At best, the Jews might expect to recover a small part of their losses. For the rest, they should be content with their liberation. Washington took a considerably more robust view. In August 1944, the Master Plan for World Economic Recovery was agreed to by the Allies at Bretton Woods, a spa in New Hampshire. Resolution 6 of the final statement called on the neutral governments to freeze all German assets in their countries and to hand them over to the Allies, who would represent the new government of Germany. Within days of publication, Sam Klaus and his close friend Herbert Cummings of the Visa section were dispatched by Cordell Hull, Secretary of State, to London and to the neutral capitals to explain the Allies' hunt. Cummings recalls that on their flight from northern Scotland to Sweden, quote, "Sam spoke the whole time with some Soviet officers in fluent Russian. They were as impressed as I was," unquote. The duo returned, having achieved little other than an agreement with the Foreign Office to collect and share intelligence about Germany's assets. Only the course of the war would shake the neutral stance of non-cooperation and indifference. The change occurred in January 1945 as Germany's desperate attack through the Ardennes was repulsed and the remnants of Hitler's last army on the Western Front retreated dejectedly toward the Rhine. Apart from innumerable German, quote, "diplomatic bags," unquote, being shipped from Spain to South America, and mysterious submarines sailing toward the South Atlantic, the obvious loopholes were fast disappearing. Argentina suspended her business links with Germany. Sweden reduced her massive exports. And Switzerland allowed her trade agreement with Germany to lapse and for the first time enforced controls. Less obvious loopholes, however, rapidly emerged. The Stockholm Patent Office was flooded by a massive number of applications from all the major German corporations, and Swedish industry purchased expensive German machinery at knockdown prices in a series of covert deals to allow their German friends to amass untouchable funds. But in February, As Allied troops swarmed across the Rhine, the Swiss agreed to meet an American safe haven delegation headed by Lachlan Curry, an enthusiastic supporter of Roosevelt's New Deal program. The agenda was to negotiate the recovery not only of Germany's loot, but also of Germany's legal assets and the estimated $500 million deposited by Jews who had since perished in the gas chambers, a total of $1.5 billion. Curry, with Klaus at his side, arrived in Bern in a belligerent mood. First, they insisted the Swiss government should conduct a methodical census of Swiss banks and industry in order to identify German assets, and then, regardless of Switzerland's secrecy laws, present the Americans with a full account. Second, all German assets should be frozen for eventually payment to the Allies as reparations for war damage. To Curry and Klaus's surprise, the Swiss negotiators, while on the surface charming and anxious to please, displayed genuine stubbornness and chilling insensitivity, the very qualities that had preserved and augmented the country's vast fortunes. Private property rights, the Swiss negotiators steadfastly maintained, were inviolable, and Switzerland's secrecy laws sacrosanct. Private property rights, the Swiss negotiators steadfastly maintained, were inviolable. Unabashed, the Americans threatened to enforce another crippling food and fuel blockade. Poker-faced, the Swiss told Curry that Washington had considerably exaggerated the German assets, but after further prevarication, they bowed to his demands and signed an agreement. The American mission left Bern convinced that a country as tiny as Switzerland could not resist the just and moral demands of the most powerful nation in the world. Allied unity, as Klaus had realized at the outset, was the key to success, but on the eve of peace, it seemed elusive. The Foreign Office, he discovered on arriving in London, had become openly skeptical about the feasibility of removing German influence from the Western Hemisphere. Klaus's policy, wrote one British official, quote, is grossly exaggerated, and it might even be in our interest to have some irritants of this kind in the Western Hemisphere, affecting American relations with Europe, unquote. What the heck does that mean? It means leave some Nazis alone? Yeah, that's what it means. The Swiss might call it blackmail, but he was certain it was justice. After all, his government had frozen Switzerland's assets in America. His anger would have been uncontrollable had he known that just 10 days after he had left Bern, the Swiss had arranged with Emil Pohl, the reptilian vice president of the Reichsbank, for the transfer of more stolen gold to the safety of Swiss banks. Ecstatically, Pohl wrote to Berlin that the agreement had evaded the American blockade and showed, quote, how strong the cultural ties are that connect our two countries, unquote. Yet Klaus's determination to wave the big stick appalled the British. Quote, the difficulty is that the Americans are itching for a fight with the neutrals on this issue, unquote. Negotiations to overcome British hesitation were entrusted to Seymour Reuben. In London during July and August, Reuben sought support for a public announcement that the Allies planned to pressure the neutrals to unconditionally hand over German assets. The British were unimpressed by the Americans' evangelical mission, even to deprive gangsters of their loot. Foreign Office officials told Reuben that there was simply no legal grounds for claiming German assets in neutral countries, since even in peacetime, one government could not compel another to hand over property. The British quoted with approval Swiss diplomats who complained that the Americans wanted greater power over Switzerland than even Hitler had wielded. Indeed, during the war, Switzerland had refused to allow the Nazi government access to private funds held on behalf of German and French citizens. The British sympathized with Switzerland's legalistic assertions and were afraid that Klaus and Reuben were intent on establishing an unfortunate precedent that other governments could use against Britain and America in the future. The Americans have a habit, commented one British official, of assuming the propriety and legality of something they do, which, if done by anybody else, they would regard as highly illegal and unethical, unquote. Moreover, Britain had more to gain by persuading the neutrals to supply food and raw materials on favorable terms. Under the weight of argument, Reuben's resolution began to buckle. An acceptable compromise, he suggested, might be for the Allies to use the moral argument. The Allies had suffered terrible losses to destroy Nazism that also benefited the neutrals. In fairness and in the interest of the future, the neutrals should now contribute something toward the Allies' rehabilitation. Although Reuben seemed to the British to favor, quote, the mailed fist in one case and the velvet glove in the other, his proposal was grudgingly accepted by British officials who meekly confessed, quote, our hands were really forced. But to his surprise, having secured admittedly reluctant backing in London, Reuben discovered that opinions had hardened and his moral appeal had no support in Washington. Since Sweden, Spain, and Portugal had already accepted the Bretton Woods Declaration, Swiss resistance, his colleagues believed, would soon begin to crumble. In Reuben's absence, Poole's gloating letter boasting about Swiss duplicity had been discovered in the Reichsbank's archives. The publication of the letter in Washington coincided with the arrival of detailed American intelligence reports from Bern, revealing that the Swiss were guilty of systematically evading the agreement they had signed after the visit by Claus and Curry. The Swiss had made no attempt to list German assets, nor were they trying to restore looted property to the rightful owners. Instead, Germans in Switzerland were discreetly selling their assets to Swiss friends at ridiculously low prices in order to avoid confiscation, while the new Swiss laws supposedly passed to enforce the seizure seemed to be deliberately riddled with loopholes. The documentary evidence of Swiss-German cunning daily exposed by investigators burrowing in the captured archives was overwhelming. While German corporations had successfully concealed their activities under the protection of Swiss secrecy laws, Swiss corporations had concealed their own illegal operations in America using other ruses. Household names like Hoffmann La Roche, Ciba Geigy, the Zurich Insurance Company, and Credit Suisse were suspected by Britain's Ministry of Economic Warfare and by the U.S. Treasury Department of having been illegally swilling millions upon millions of dollars around the financial system. For dedicated young officials like Claus and Reuben, a crusade against such blatantly amoral entrepreneurs seemed amply justified in view of the callous treatment accorded surviving victims of the Nazi era by the Swiss. Europeans emerging from exile, hiding, or concentration camps to reclaim their property in Switzerland were confronted by cruelly expensive legal procedures and an insurmountable 5-year statute of limitations. Swiss officials coldly replied to American and British protests that the victims of Nazism could not expect privileged treatment. Accordingly, German Jews who had been deprived of their citizenship by Nazi racial laws discovered on arrival from the concentration camps that under Swiss law they were still deemed to be German citizens and their property was therefore frozen. The Swiss had also unquestioningly assumed that they could keep the assets of the Nazis' victims who died without heirs. Non-Jewish Germans, Allied agents reported, did not suffer similar discrimination. Swiss bankers and businessmen were effortlessly crossing the border into Germany to meet old and new clients to arrange for their wealth to be securely hidden from confiscation. In the meantime, the Swiss government played a delaying game vis-à-vis the safe haven negotiators, provoking Claus to demand the reimposition of a food and fuel blockade and renewed pressure on the British to support Washington's tough policy. Despite these acute disagreements with Washington, by November, the British, under pressure from France and Russia, as well as America, had been dragooned into the line. Self-pityingly, Foreign Office officials grumbled, quote, we leave the solar plexus unguarded, unquote, and reluctantly agreed to the publication of a 4-power ultimatum to the Swiss. Just 4 weeks later, Fearing a blockade, the Swiss handed the American embassy its census of German assets. The total value was just $250 million. Uncoincidentally, it was exactly the amount Switzerland was claiming from Germany. The list of assets was clearly far from complete. For those in Washington committed to extracting Germany's loot, the census did not augur well. To isolate the Swiss, Washington insisted that negotiations be held in America. Dr. Walter Stucky, Switzerland's obdurate wartime ambassador in Vichy, France, and later chief of the Foreign Ministry's political division, arrived in the American capital with a simple brief: to prevaricate and to concede absolutely nothing. Stucky denied the Allies' right to German assets, called on them to prove in detail every allegedly stolen bar of gold, and insisted on a restricted definition of German assets. The American negotiators were incensed, but recognized that the lukewarm support of the British substantially weakened their case. 1 year after the war, the efficacy of the blockade had dissolved, but Washington had another, more powerful weapon in its armory: Switzerland's own huge assets still frozen by the American government. The threat of maintaining that freeze produced immediate results. Displaying signs of pained submission and insisting that Switzerland could not recognize the legal basis of the Allied claims, Stucky effected a compromise by offering $250 million Swiss francs as compensation for the stolen gold, plus a more honest and complete census. The American negotiators hailed the offer as satisfactory and immediately released their commercial strangleholds. In fact, the Washington Accord, as Stucky proudly realized, left Switzerland with everything in her favor. The compensation for the stolen gold underestimated Switzerland's illegal profits. Germany's assets were still safe because their identification remained a matter of Swiss discretion, and most of the German property in Switzerland was already excluded from the deal because ownership had, for the time being, been fraudulently assigned to non-Germans. Yeah, Toto's mad about this, and I don't blame her. It was a full year before Washington realized how it had been outsmarted by the fat Swiss negotiator, and even then, the full implications were not apparent. As American diplomats inquired about progress, Herr Stucky unleashed a series of bombshells upon the unsuspecting Allies. First, the question of the Swiss-German exchange rate, then conflicts about ownership, then details about compensating the Germans for the expropriation of their property, and finally, the news about the newly created state of West Germany refused to recognize the accord. News that the newly created state of West Germany refused to recognize the accord. Naively, American diplomats had believed that Stucky accepted Rubin's argument regarding Switzerland's moral responsibility. At first, Stucky's prevarication was explained as an untenable but reasonably understandable defense of Swiss honor. Months later, Allied diplomats condemned him as a notoriously obstinate man who was also tricky, pompous, and difficult to deal with. But their outrage and vows to avenge Swiss perfidy were hot air, and the British predictably refused outright to put pressure on Bern. Klaus, Rubin, and the other moral knights witnessed what they had always suspected: that a banker looks after his clients' interests in peace and war, regardless of their misdeeds. Switzerland's future credibility as a safe haven depended upon its protection of its German deposits. By 1948, when the emergence of a new sovereign German state was expected within months, Stucky boldly refused to liquidate any German property, explaining that he was not satisfied that the German owners would receive the 100% compensation he felt was their due. Washington countered that 5% was the maximum that could be justified. Bern protested that the Allies were making unwarranted attempts to force the Swiss to adopt the Allied point of view. And London accepted the unpleasant reality that the Swiss made an agreement and are now laughing in our face. 3 years after the war, the safe haven program had become a farce. While Swiss banks, in defiance of all Allied laws, secretly negotiated with German industry, the Swiss National Bank adamantly refused to return the stolen Dutch gold lying in its vaults, although Reichsbank documents discovered by Dutch investigators proved that the Swiss had always been aware of the gold's origin and true ownership. Moral arguments about Holland's plight were of no avail and were unashamedly ignored by Bern. Worse still, other neutral countries like Portugal studied and copied the rewards of Swiss stubbornness faithfully. Among the 45 tons of stolen gold deposited in Lisbon lay some of the Dutch gold still stored in its original wrappings. Mischievously, the Portuguese government insisted that the Allies would have to identify each of nearly 2,000 bars of gold individually to prove it was looted, although investigators painstakingly identified 32 tons, as much loot as if the bank held the Mona Lisa itself without even retouching it, unquote. The Portuguese, emulating Swiss methods, refused to hand over more than 3 tons, and even then only in exchange for German assets in Portugal. Washington wearily acquiesced. The Swedish government also followed Switzerland's example. Having handed over 7 tons of stolen gold, it retained another 9 tons, dishonestly claiming that the gold had been acquired legally. At the end of the safe haven negotiations with Spain, practically nothing had been accomplished. In August 1949, the new government of Germany took office, and the presence of a resurgent power in Bonn cast the safe haven program into terminal paralysis. German government officials openly approached all the neutral governments, intimidating them into agreeing that the safe haven negotiations were unlawful and that the Germans would expect compensation for the theft of their property. The reawakening belligerence of Germany indicated that it does not have even the slightest notion of returning Nazi loot or of offering adequate compensation to the victims of the Third Reich. Anticipating the failure of safe haven, Claus's targets in Germany had clandestinely and diligently planned for the inevitable removal of every obstacle of German expansion. No one in Washington suspected that from beneath the endless moonscape of rubble, a dispirited nation could so suddenly rise and be transformed into a series of booming megalopolises. Yet, within months of statehood, every British fear was confirmed. Casting aside the ignominy of defeat, German industry and banks brazenly emerged to challenge, then rapidly overtake their conquerors. The banner headline in the London Mail of January 21st, 1949 registered the shock, quote, "German revival, British industry alarmed," unquote. The newspaper's report explained how British exports were endangered. Many believe that West Germany's meteoric rise to riches was entirely due to the introduction of the Deutschmark, the new currency. But that myth was born of ignorance of what had occurred beyond the view of the public. The truth is substantially more sinister. In Washington, a number of officials expected the resurgence of German industry, but only Samuel Claus and a few sympathizers had wanted to prevent it. And they had failed for a series of reasons. Within Germany, the early schemes of the American military government to destroy the Masonic industrial cartels had been curbed as a result of the unrelenting political, commercial, and diplomatic pressure from Congress, New York bankers, and the British government. I'm going to go back and read that again because I didn't believe that when I first read it. Let me read this sentence again. Within Germany, the early schemes of the American military government to destroy the Masonic industrial cartels, wow, had been curbed as a result of unrelenting political, commercial, and diplomatic pressure from Congress, New York bankers, and the British government. Plans to re-equip American and British industry with German machinery promised to the Allies by way of reparations had foundered because of mass protests by German workers and the sabotage by German dismantlers who skillfully omitted to pack and dispatch vital parts. Also in Germany, powerful industrialists convicted of war crimes at Nuremberg, the directors of Krupp, IG Farben, Flick, and the Dresdner Bank, were promised early release and were able to plan new ventures from Landsberg prison. The Allied policy and plans to remove the Nazis and their supporters from the civil service, the judiciary, the educational system, the professions, and the police had lamentably failed. Germany was not denazified. 4 years after the war, those responsible for the day-to-day management of post-war Germany were remarkably similar to the management during the days of Hitler. Triggered by the evident failure of safe haven, the bankers and industrialists who had conspired after June 1944 to lay the foundations of their post-war prosperity began to draw on their massive hidden funds. The looted money and machinery that had laid dormant in the neutral countries was used to finance and feed Germany's famed economic miracle, the Wirtschaftswunder. Throughout war-stricken Europe, survivors and victors alike were baffled by the pace and strength of Germany's revival. Surely all of Germany's industrial and scientific secrets had been seized by the Allies for their own benefit, and the Germans would suffer crippling disadvantages for years to come. The answers to this question were harsh and simple. To people outside Germany, Allied air raids appeared to inflict widespread damage, but the most devastating bombing struck the residential areas at the heart of the cities. Since the majority of factories were on the outskirts, they survived comparatively unscathed. Moreover, since Germany's wartime capacity was many times greater than her peacetime needs, the machinery and materials snatched as plunder or reparations were of little consequence to German industrialists. Much of the booty seized by the Allies was obsolescent or redundant and was replaced by improved and more modern developments, which were more valuable than their predecessors. The Allies' great triumph was the recruitment of German scientists, or so they thought. But most of the scientists brought to the United States under the aegis of Project Paperclip were primarily of military interest. Knowing they would be virtually unemployable in post-war Germany, they made themselves freely available to the highest bidder. For the Allied military, the scientists were the intended booty of war, but in fact, with notable exceptions, the military was buying cast-offs of the German armaments industry and intentionally excluding civil interests from booty hunting. Paperclip and the use of German scientists by other allies was profitable because it gave an invaluable boost to their scientific and technical expertise. Without it, the American space program would have been greatly delayed. But the question remains, at what price? Should the military be condemned for ruthlessly excluding the interests of industry and commerce, or of civilian science and medicine? Should it be praised or criticized for its single-mindedness? And can there be any justifications for its determined to employ men who had committed crimes against humanity, and for the web of conspiracy and deception that Paperclip inspired? In the ultimate reckoning, could it be that Klaus was right? Most would agree. Most would argue that West Germany's solid democracy and the West's enviable prosperity prove that the plunder of Germany caused no casualties. Others will say that the moral cost was too high. It was a final irony that only those who directly profited or lost would understand. Well, there's about 3 more pages here, and I know I'm after the noon hour, but I think I'll read it. It's called Aftermath. In mid-October 1984, the Paperclip Conspiracy was publicly exposed. In a terse statement, the Department of Justice in Washington announced that Arthur Rudolph, the director of production at Nordhausen, and later the director of the Saturn V rocket project at the George Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama, had, on March 27th, returned to Germany. The statement also announced Rudolph had voluntarily renounced his American citizenship at the American consulate in Hamburg. The department's explanation was simple. At Nordhausen, Rudolph had participated in the persecution of forced laborers, including concentration camp inmates, who were employed there under inhumane conditions. The 77-year-old rocket expert, who had been awarded NASA's highest civilian honors, had opted to avoid the anguish and embarrassment that would automatically accompany the courtroom debate. The cause of Rudolph's sudden and silent departure had been an investigation launched by the Justice Department's Office of Special Investigation, the OSI, had been established in 1979 to look into cases of suspected Nazi war criminals who had improperly obtained American citizenship, having arrived as apparently genuine refugees from Europe. The OSI's activities were followed by a succession of highly publicized exposures of former Nazi mass murderers who were leading ostensibly respectable lives in American communities. Eli Rosenbaum, an OSI lawyer, happened to read the book Dora, a grim account of life in the underground Nordhausen factory, written by one of its few survivors, Jean Michel. Comparing it with the account of the V-2's development in the rocket team, a comprehensive and flattering history written with the full cooperation of Werner von Braun, Rosenbaum had been amazed by the Germans' apparent callousness toward the Nordhausen workers. In particular, Rosenbaum was struck by a quotation from Rudolph about the inconvenience of leaving a convivial New Year's Eve party in 1943 to attend a production problem. Rudolph, it seemed, had harbored little compassion for the inmates. Stirred by this seeming immorality, Rosenbaum dug deeper and discovered in the U.S. Army's own archives Rudolph's voluminous and long-forgotten personal file, classified secret. Almost at a glance, Rosenbaum, then barely 30 years old, understood the conspiracy and manipulations of the revised security reports organized by a previous generation. On the open shelves at the National Archives in Washington, Rosenbaum found the microfilm reels that contained the record of the American Army's Dora Nordhausen war crimes trial. The criminality of Rudolph and the rocket team had by now been simply forgotten. For the OSI was an undoubted, although isolated, victory. Within the previous decade, von Braun, Kurt Debus, and Walter Dornberger had died, and the existing evidence against other surviving German scientists was at best circumstantial. In Huntsville and elsewhere, the Paperclip Germans were outraged that during the evening of their lives, their services to America should be so swiftly ignored by the exposure of their conspiracy with the victors of World War II. It was blatant ingratitude. Quote, I helped put the first man, an American, on the moon, and then I was treated like this, unquote, complained Rudolph in Hamburg in 1986. Quote, the Americans are very ungrateful, and I am very bitter, unquote. We should have squeezed them like lemons and sent them back to Germany, preferably for prosecution, said Rosenbaum said. Beneath these irreconcilable emotions lies the truth that despite any dubious morality or circumventing of justice, the Pentagon's Paperclip conspiracy was, within its limitations, unquestionably successful. And of course, that Office of Special Investigations, the investigator John Loftus is, that's where we can pick up the story if we want to start reading some of his books, which I have not quite at hand, but I know his work over the unholy Trinity and the Belarus Secret. A couple of very interesting indeed books. Okay. I read probably 80% of the book, and I'm glad I did, and especially that last chapter, because you know what it really is still a complete secret that the Americans and the British somehow conspired with the German industrialists to leave the money in the hands of those Nazis and their financiers, and that, of course, is just a huge, huge story that is not told in our high schools, not told in our colleges, and not acknowledged in any of our media.